Hello everyone, and welcome back to History of Sexuality. As you know, during the final 3 weeks of the semester, we are turning our attention to countries outside of Western Europe and North America. Our goal here is to determine the extent to which modern global developments in sexuality, let's say from the early 20th century to the present, have been influenced by Western concepts, techniques, and identities. Last week, we looked at Iran, and we saw that ideas about sexuality and gender there diverge in some very important ways from those seen in places like the United States. This week, we're traveling to southern Africa, and specifically to Zimbabwe, in order to look at the evolution of sexual beliefs and behaviors there. Our particular focus this week is going to be on homosexuality, and in our conversations, we're going to be pursuing a few basic questions, including: how far back do same-sex sexual practices and relationships date in Southern African history? How have these relationships and practices changed over the course of the last couple centuries? And to what extent do these changes reflect the influence of Western norms, practices, and identities? What makes these such important questions is that, interestingly, there has long been a belief that same-sex sexual relations are an incredibly recent thing in Southern African history. In the 1800s, for example, many European imperialists argued that same-sex sexual relations were rare in Africa. One example was the British ethnographer Sir Richard Burton. In his writings, Burton contended that human sexual behavior was a function of climate. The hotter the annual average temperature of a region, he argued, the more likely homosexuality was to flourish there. Countries near the equator, including those along the Mediterranean, in North Africa, and across the Middle East and across Asia, lay in what Burton called the sotatic zone. Here, he argued, homosexual behavior was widespread and indigenous. But outside this zone, he argued, it was not. And as you can see in the map on the screen here, Burton included all of sub-Saharan Africa in the non-sotatic zone. Now, obviously, there is no causal relationship between climate and sexuality. Yet, even after Burton's ideas were discredited, the idea that homosexuality was non-existent in traditional pre-colonial African societies has remained a very popular one. It has found support even among professional historians. For example, in his pioneering history of migrant labor in colonial Zimbabwe, one historian, Charles van Osselen, argues that while homosexual relationships did occur in 19th century mining camps throughout southern Africa, this was only because European companies actually encouraged them, so as to prevent workers from rebelling against an industry that kept men separated from their wives and children for long periods of time. In studies like this, homosexuality, when it exists, is attributed to racial capitalism, not to the active preference of some men for other men, or for that matter, some women for other women. In keeping with this idea, contemporary political leaders like longtime Zimbabwean Prime Minister Robert Mugabe argue that homosexuality is, quote-unquote, un-African, and that its existence on the continent owes entirely to Western influence. Is this really true? Is this belief in the exclusive heterosexuality of Black Africans a valid one? In answering this question, I want to first say a few things about languages. Because, as it happens, South African languages have lots of words for describing same-sex sexual relations. Some of these are quite new. Consider Zimbabwe, for example, where the main indigenous language is called Chishona. In the 1990s, gay activists there coined the term Hungochani to describe people who identify as homosexual. This actually derives from a much older word, a word called Ngochanu, which is a derogatory slur that invokes shame, anger, and denial, and that is considered a highly offensive insult. But as its existence suggests, some indigenous words for homosexuality in southern Africa are not recent inventions. To give some other older examples, in isiZulu, which is the main language of South Africa, the word Nkoshana means copulation between male persons, and it dates back several centuries. In southern Mozambique, words like Titonkana and Bukonhana, which respectively mean boy wives and mine marriages, date back to the 19th century. Taken together, this vocabulary points to a regional proto-queer identity firmly rooted in southern African traditions. But do we have other evidence for this? How diverse and variegated was sexuality in pre-modern southern Africa? Judging from available records and material artifacts, it seems that traditional cultures here were very heteronormative and placed a great deal of value on reproductive sex between men and women. By around 1200 AD, patriarchal societies had been established throughout the region, and all of these aimed to control female sexuality in various ways. One way was through an institution known as lobola, or bride price. This originated as a token gift of cattle given by the groom to the bride's family, in acknowledgement of the female labor that the bride's family had just lost through marriage. Families of virgin wives commonly received a bonus payment as a reward for keeping their daughters sexually chaste, and with this, female virginity became a prized asset. The most wealthy used the institution of lobola to expand their households and to marry multiple women. Given all of this, it seems that adults in pre-modern Southern African societies experienced strong pressures to conform to heteronormative expectations. However, this does not mean that homosexuality was non-existent. For one, both girls and boys were raised largely within homosocial environments, and a certain degree of homosexual experimentation was considered normal. Moreover, while homosexuality was considered illicit, same-sex sexual transgressions were not always punished very severely. Consider the practice of kusenga, where unmarried girls manually stretched each other's labias through daily exercises that could go on for hours at a time. The goal of this activity was to make girls more pleasing to their future husbands, but still, kusenga could have created a space for female homosexuality. For males, a comparable institution might be sawira. This was an intimate male friendship in which men bonded by sharing the details of their sex lives, including talking about their wives' sexual performance and physical appearance. Sometimes they even exchanged wives as a gesture of friendship. While sawira did not connote homoerotic attraction, it nevertheless also provided a space where men who were so inclined or curious could play with each other sexually without attracting any criticism. Southern African spiritual beliefs also made space for homosexuality. Most notably, those homosexual infractions thought to be the result of witchcraft often brought no shame upon individuals who were looked on as helpless, innocent victims. In other cases, People who displayed more permanent affections for those of their own sex were sometimes believed to be possessed by spirits of the opposite sex. A male who took the role of a wife was known as murum ekzadi, or man-woman, and a female who took the role of a man with another woman was called mukadzirume, or woman-man. These couples sometimes could live together without causing much dispute. Same-sex sexual acts and relationships, in other words, were not necessarily taken as a serious breach of morality. Often they were not investigated or punished, in part because of fears of spirit possession, which might lead to retaliation in the form of witchcraft. Speaking to this, one modern-day Zimbabwean has claimed that, quote, "In my home village, there were several men staying in homosexual relationships, and the community never talked about it. They were regarded as unstable or bewitched, or witches themselves. People were afraid that maybe they would be violent because of the assumed instability, or that they, the accusers, might in turn be bewitched. So basically, the homosexuals were left alone." So then, acts that were forbidden could be tolerated as long as they were done discreetly, and as long as they did not attract the community's notice. Because of this, we actually know very little about these relationships, but they certainly occurred because sometimes they came before the courts. For example, in 1923, a village headman brought two men named Mashumba and Njebe before colonial authorities after hearing that one had physically beaten the other. In their testimony to the court, both Mashumba and Njebe admitted that they had regularly had mutual penetrative sex together over a period of about 3 years. At some point, their relationship ended, and when Mashumba tried to resume it, violence ensued. According to Njebe, quote, "I struck the accused because he said, 'Come on, let us mount one another as before.'" Traditional culture appears to have been more tolerant of sexual diversity than many modern societies recognize. While the rules of pre-modern Zimbabwean society were heteronormative, they could be broken without serious consequences. For example, if parents noticed that their child was developing in a gender non-conforming way, they would first try to, quote-unquote, cure this problem with shaming and perhaps a beating or two. If this failed, it could be interpreted to mean that he or she was possessed by a spirit of the opposite sex. And in these cases, the child in question would be apprenticed to learn the arts of divination. As time went on, the female spirit occupying a male body would manifest increasingly feminine characteristics. In these cases, it could hardly be expected that they would be interested in sex with women. Sometimes they would take male husbands and take the role of wives. In a spiritual capacity, they were thought to be an asset, a positive good for the community. As one contemporary Zimbabwean has stated, quote, "There are no lesbians in our culture, but we have special women who will be given powers by strong nyangas to act as mabonga for the chief. The woman will not marry for the rest of her life, but instead will be pledged to a spirit that acts as a guardian for the chief. For the spirit to guard the chief properly, it needs a wife, because it is obvious that a strong bodyguard must be a man. The mabonga is given the woman as his wife. She will be used as his wife without her knowledge when she is asleep. In return, she is given all the favors of the chief. The mabonga will be treated as if she is someone else's real wife, because if any man tries to court her, the spirit will cause bad luck for him. That is why she will never, ever have sex with a man." And with that remark, we'll conclude this discussion of sexuality in pre-modern Zimbabwean society. Please do take a look at the questions I posted earlier in this lecture and share your thoughts on them in our discussion board. I look forward to reading your thoughts and continuing this conversation next time as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later. Bye-bye for now.